Welcome everyone to episode 12 of Just About Managing podcast. For those of you watching, will notice a slight difference here in that there isn't three completely bald guys in front of you today. There's two. John, unfortunately, has been called away on urgent business, so he can't make today's podcast. But we do have our second guest. So we have Craig Preston joining us, who we will introduce shortly in here. Just for context today, it's quite a monumental day. It's Friday the 5th of July. It's the day after the elections. We have a new Prime Minister, and Chris is also in Germany, ahead of England versus Switzerland in the quarterfinals tomorrow. So when you're watching this, he may be celebrating, he may be commiserating, because this will go out afterwards, obviously. But fingers crossed for tomorrow, Chris, for that one. But welcome to today's episode. As I say, we've got our second guest of the series on today in Craig Preston. Just as a brief background before I ask Craig to introduce himself, I didn't know Craig until I left HSBC, despite him working there a number of years and working with a number of my colleagues, both directly and indirectly through training or through coaching in there. And I was actually introduced to Craig when I left HSBC in about March, April last year, through a friend of mine, an ex-colleague in there who Craig knows, and a shout out to Rishi Sunak, who introduced us and set the initial discussions up. And ever since then, Craig has been absolutely phenomenal for me, I have to say that. So he's been a support, a mentor, a coach, a friend through that whole period. So first of all, thank you very much, Craig, for the last year and a half, whatever it's been, because it's been a fantastic support in there. So as I say, welcome to this different episode of Just About Managing. And Craig, to start us off, would you like to give us just a bit of an introduction to your background and what you're doing and what you've done in the past, if that's okay?
Thanks, Lee. And just an opportunity for a quick thumbnail sketch of my background. I believe that there'll be a number of people who are watching this who do know me from the work I've done at HSBC. And for those, hi again, because I haven't seen you for a while. But I've been a mentor and a coach on my own right for a few years now, and did quite a lot of work with HSBC, particularly technology. My world before that was as managing director of a company called IDG, who ran leadership programs for HSBC and for many other organisations in public sector, commercial world, on a global basis, elite sport, and so on. So quite a broad approach to leadership and management. Prior to that, my background is essentially, I left school, went to Sandhurst, and then I spent nearly 20 years in the army as an officer, serving all over the place. I went to work then for Coca-Cola for 4 years in sales and distribution management. I then went into consulting for the first time, spent a few years doing work for IDG as a pure consultant. And then I left and went and joined one of our clients, Aon. For those who follow football, they're on the front of the Manchester United training shirts. But for those who know them commercially, they're about insurance and risk. And I was a consultant and then a retail leader looking after a region, Midlands, Wales and the South West, their corporate business across the UK, before I went to IDG. So experience hopefully as not just as a coach, but as a leader myself, and someone who's done formal leadership training at the beginning of my career at Sandhurst, which I always maintain is a real positive for the way that the armed forces and the police and a few others tend to look at leadership, which is we train people to be leaders before they ask them to lead. Whereas in most of the rest of the world, we appoint people in leadership and then hope that they can lead and may provide them with some help and support afterwards, including politics. So what sympathy I have, and we'll take politics out of it, for those who are political leaders who have not done what they'd like to have done, and let's take Mr. Sunak as an example. He's had no formal leadership training at all in his life, but has been asked to lead the fifth largest economy in the world. So quite a challenge for somebody, and maybe there will be a bit of imposter syndrome in there for him. But let's come back. And by the way, I have done some work with the Prime Minister of Jordan, funny enough, in the past, and his government. Slightly different context, but politics nonetheless. Anyway, that's my background. For those of you watching the football, I can't follow football. Rugby is my main sport, but I don't follow football, and I'm a long-suffering Evertonian. With great hopes for Mr. Dyche, who I think should be managing England next anyway.
One step at a time.
Back to you,
Craig, I'm like a tiny bit disappointed, right? Because it would have been so good if you were such an avid North End fan that you changed your surname to Preston. That would have just been like, look, here's my North End tattoo. Yeah. I can't imagine it, but yeah. Oh.
Well, listen, I suppose I'm a big David Moyes fan because he did a lot for Everton and at West Ham. But of course, where did he make his name? At Preston. So there's a little bit of that there.
Yeah, Preston, indeed.
I love it.
Cool.
I love it. No, thanks for the intro, Craig, in the background. And I think it's such an interesting context there with both you talked about military, the business, the sport. I know you've done some work with the RFU as well in the past. So there's that real connection through all of those elements in there. And we thought that actually, given the timing of this, sort of post-election, pre-quarterfinal of the World Cup, the Euros. God, I'm getting ahead of myself already. Pre-quarterfinal of the Euros, and the business context of the podcast, we thought might be quite an interesting topic to talk about the different dynamics of leadership without getting political, across politics, sport and business, and those similarities and differences in how people lead and what they do. So I don't know again, before we get into it, into pure discussion, Chris, anything that you thought yourself in that sort of space at all since everything's happened over the last few days, particularly you were at the game last weekend, weren't you?
Yeah, I was at the England game last week, and I will be in Dusseldorf for the game tomorrow. So we're leaving here. We're currently in the Eiffel National Forest, which is about 2 hours from Dusseldorf. There wasn't much leadership on the pitch last week. Just vague long throws and then a spectacular overhead kick. And my voice is just still like I'm shouting my head off. So it was brilliant. So all ears, Craig, to hear like what you're going to say in all those spaces. And yeah, maybe I can stop off in Blankenheim and give Gareth a couple of tips ahead of tomorrow. I don't know.
Well, it's again, Gareth Southgate. What leadership development has he had in his? Funny enough, he is an ardent student of leadership and culture and so on. And it's an interesting contrast. And there's a few people that I know from my time in working in sports who know him well, and he's very good at a number of things. And the way I would describe, we'll talk about sport, and then perhaps I can contrast it with politics. But sport, leadership at the level. So you talk about leadership on the pitch, which is first line leadership, emotional leadership. Depending on the sport, the leaders have a certain amount of say in how the game goes. So in cricket, the captain does a lot. In football, it's limited. A lot of decisions are made from the touchline during it. But there are 3 components for me in leading a sports team like England or indeed a club. And those 3 are, firstly, culture, ways of working, what's it like to be around here, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and so on. So setting a culture. And I think Gareth Southgate is very good at that. And certainly people who've been around him would say that he's been very good at that. The second bit is about selection for the battle, if you like, from a military point of view. Who's going to fight the battle here? And part of that is based on what I've got, but part of that is also based on what the opposition have got and how they play and so on. In the military, when you're doing an assessment before any sort of operational commitment, the first factor you are asked to consider is enemy forces. Before you think about yourself, enemy forces. Who are they? What do they do? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? How do they operate? And what's the ground like? And funny enough, that's slightly pertinent in this grade because I gather some of the pitches haven't been great. But So where are we playing or fighting and so on. And then the third and a really the crucial component is battle management. So as the game unfolds, as the battle unfolds, where do I place my men? What do I do? Who should be doing what? Now, take it back 150 years or more. You used to have a general sat on the hilltop watching the battle, and saying, "Hey, move them over there. I want the guns over here, and I want the cavalry coming round there, and I want stop. This is what the opposition have done, so I'm going to do something different." And in order to be really successful over time, you've got to be good at those three. And my observation of dear Gareth is he sometimes falls short on the third one. On the third one, it's battle management. What's happening? This isn't working. And you get others. So if we talk about rugby, Eddie Jones, he took over from Stuart Lancaster. Stuart Lancaster was a very good culture man, selection, okay, but not great at battle management. Because we started to lose games, even though we had great teams on the pitch. Eddie Jones took over, not good at culture, not bad at selection, bloody good at battle management. And very early on in his time, he played against Australia, funnily enough, with a team in Australia. And after 11 minutes, he made a substitution. It wasn't working. Bang. A guy who was on his first cap. And he just took him off, put him on, and England won the game. So it's there's those three. And those are the things that are really very, very pertinent. If I then go to politics, it's not quite the same. However, those components are still reasonably relevant. So you've got culture and the way of doing things, which have a much more, as they have done over the last few years, much bigger impact on what the stakeholders of the organisation, so in politics, the electorate, think about the organisation. And again, take politics out of it. But if you look at the culture, firstly under Boris Johnson, where it became very obvious that the culture reflected his particular personality and style. He's been known to have been economical with the truth, if I'm being honest, over many, many years. That gradually erodes people's trust. And so what people say they're going to do, if they're not delivering it, people will think, are they actually going to do it going forward? Then you have, so his culture wasn't great. If you then look at selection and battle management of Liz Truss, maybe Theresa May, and then Rishi Sunak, it's weak. And you've also got a point, and maybe I'll come on to it later on, about how culture develops over time, bearing in mind that we're in power for 14 years, and what that impact that has on the electorate. Now, if I go back to the sporting bit again, just to wrap that one up, the leadership is about fundamentally the emotional side, hearts and minds. I'm taking you somewhere you've never been before. That's what pure leadership is. I'm going to convince you to follow me, to go somewhere, and you're going to be safe, and you're going to be secure, and we're going to deliver, and so on. Follow me. That's what leadership's about. Management is checking we're on track. Management is about, are we delivering what we said we're going to deliver? And how do we know that? We know that about ticking boxes. So let me take Lee, I think I shared this one with you before, the metaphor of running a marathon. Okay, so running a marathon. So I'm the boss, and Chris, we've agreed that you're going to run a marathon in a few weeks or a month's time, and between us we're going to agree a time. So we're going to do 4 hour marathon. That's fantastic. You're up for this, Chris. Yeah, brilliant. Never done it before, but we're up for it. 4 hour marathon. That means 9-minute miling, basically. 9-minute miling. Super duper. I know, I trust you. I think you're going to be fantastic. So the leader gets you up for it, okay? And the leader may say, look, we're going to be there at the beginning. Off we go. I know you can do it. The manager The manager is the one that says, right, where are you going to be after 3 hours, or 3 miles? I think we'll be about 27 minutes then, isn't it? 9 minute miling, 27 minutes. Right. Manager says, I'll be at the 3 mile point, and we'll check you're on time. Okay. Now, pure manager is going to be stood there at the 3 mile point, looking at the clock. If you're 26 minutes and 30 seconds, you're ahead of time, it's fine. Crack on. No problem. If you're 27 minutes 30, you're behind time. So the manager will say, you better speed up, hadn't you? You better speed up. You're behind schedule. I'm going to see you at the 6 mile point. Make sure you're on time. The leader will be saying, if he knows the time, and this is the problem, if he or she knows the time, will be saying, God, you're a bit behind. Never mind. Don't worry. I've got faith in you. By the way, you want to pick your feet up a bit here. Here's Lee. He's run it before. Why don't you stay with him? In fact, let me run with you for the next half mile just to check you're all right. I've got complete faith in you. It's going to be really tough, but you're going to pick it up and so on. What's your nutrition? Do we need to get that sorted? So the leader is still there to support, motivate, encourage, direct, and so on. The manager purely ticks the box. But you need both, because the leader at some stage needs to know they're on track. Otherwise, you're blind going into it. Everyone feels great, but you're miles behind, or you may even be ahead. The manager makes sure that it's on time. That's why you've got to have a good COO. You've got to have a good COO, but a COO with empathy.
We should have had John on the call. This we're missing John, you see. He was COO when I was at HSBC, and he had that. That's great. There you go.
Yeah, good management with empathy. That's what a COO should do.
100%. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. So what's your thoughts, Craig, just on, so Rishi, right? So with, the day after, the morning after, the day before, the nightmare. What's your thoughts around the leadership piece and then the management piece, right? Because when he was in managing, so it's still a leadership position when he was like in the Chancellor.
Well, he was. He was.
What do you think about his transition between Chancellor and Prime Minister? Right, because he seemed a lot to have more leadership potential in that old role. Just interested, like, what's your thoughts around him and that transition?
I think it's fair to say, Chris, that he made his name being a good manager. That's what he made his name being a good manager. He also made his name being very honest, which was a contrast to Boris and then to Liz Truss, and so on. Where he unfortunately was then exposed was his leadership, not his management, because he clearly didn't. And I was invited to do a short piece on. By the way, this doesn't reflect my politics necessarily, but on GB News, where I was asked to talk about. This was the time where Rishi Sunak was about to be appointed as the leader of the Conservative Party and therefore Prime Minister. And I was asked, what would his priorities be as a leader taking over now based on what he'd had in the past? And I said, right, first thing is he has to build a truly effective senior leadership team. He's got to build a team around him that's loyal, that looks after each other, looks out for each other, sees things the same way, speaks the same messages, and gets stuff done. Okay, and get stuff done. But essentially, I just said, go away to Chequers for a while, just get the team to build as a team. You have to, as a senior leadership, in a senior leadership role. He didn't do that. So he had a disparate bunch of people in different roles, who didn't speak the same language as each other, who had different priorities. He also talked about, and this is something about politics, which is interesting, which is you're elected based on what you say you're going to do, not necessarily what you have done. So if you're a CEO of an organisation, then you're appointed over a period of time to do it. But you're measured, and your success is on what the shareholders have seen you do over time. So you don't say after 5 years or 14 years, actually, we didn't do what we said we could do, but this is what we're going to do next, and expect everybody to believe you. You've had it.
No.
Whereas in politics, typically, it's all about what we said it can do. And it's been interesting watching the Conservative Party say, this is what we're going to do, national service, we're going to do all sorts of different things. People finally going, well, hang on, what have you been doing in the last 14 years? I don't trust that element of it. And the team don't talk the same language. You've got people openly criticising the boss. I mean, can you imagine you, Chris, as a COO, openly criticising the CEO in public and being able to keep your job, or lying and being able to keep your job? Now, where I was saying Rishi went wrong was the first time he had the opportunity to say, this is the culture right now. Talk about culture again. This is the culture right now. That behaviour doesn't fit the culture I'm talking about, that you're out. That would have had a massive effect. What he did was he said, I'm going to have an inquiry. And based on the results, and it was the Chancellor at the time who had the tax issues with the HMRC, and I can't remember the name, but it was obvious which way it was going to go. The Chancellor was going to have to go. And so I've got to wait for the inquiry, so it wasn't me making the decision. Wasn't me. Missed his opportunity. Now, Mr. Sir Keir Starmer, when he finally gets in and starts to do his stuff, his track record so far is anyone who steps out of line in his party is gone, or they're suspended, or whatever. So it's a very clear message as to about what the culture is, what we accept and what we don't accept. Let's see what happens going forward. But what I've been watching carefully over the last few years has been the fascinating story of Boris Johnson. I don't know if if you get the chance to listen to the Radio 4 series of podcasts about him called Boris, it's fascinating to see his history from childhood onwards. He's lied at every stage. Yet keeps bouncing back. Even a couple of days ago, people cheering him on. So there's this interesting dynamic about people and who they're happy to have lead them at a very senior level. So, the Prime Minister is way above us. Now, if their ethics aren't quite right and so on, how much does that matter to me at my level? First line management matters a lot. And in a lot of engagement studies, you find that people have got faith in their immediate line manager, but not in senior management. But it doesn't mean they're going to leave. Okay, it doesn't mean they're going to leave. They can be pretty upset, but they're not going to leave. But they've got this first line, I've got to trust them. That level, not quite so much. Look at the United States. Okay, the leadership that Donald Trump provides is one from a person who is a criminal and who is whose business has been involved in fraud, whose a number of the previous appointees are either in jail or yet 50% of the population are happy to vote for him. It's extraordinary. But I guarantee you, if he was their immediate line manager, they wouldn't. So it's that, do I feel safe? Do I feel secure? Do I feel whatever? But, and I suppose the important bit to wrap up this little rant, the crucial bit for me is leadership, and was once described by a chap called John Adair, who was a lecturer at Sandhurst for many years, and the task team individual action-centred leadership stuff that people still use at Sandhurst and elsewhere now started with him. But John Adair what said that the definition of leadership is example. And so what do I need to do? How does the leadership behave? And do I feel comfortable about that? And so what do I need to do to get on around here? What's acceptable, what's not acceptable? Do I trust that person? Do I trust that way? Do I feel comfortable in this culture? What example does the boss set? and culture emanates down from the top. So if you've got somebody at the top who is whose ethics are questionable, then watch it filter down. If they behave in a particular way, then everybody else is allowed to behave in that way. You can't build culture from the bottom up. You build it from the top down. And so I'm not surprised to see, what's ultimately happened to the Conservative Party, and let's see what happens in the future and how they rebuild. But culture starts at the top. The examples, and all leaders at all levels, people look at you, and take the way you behave as the example as to how things should be done round here. So it's not just about the decision making. It's not just about battle management. It's not just about selection. It's about culture. And to finish this bit, there's a quote from a chap called Peter Drucker, which I refer to a lot, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can have the best plan in the world, but if your culture's crap, it's unlikely to be achieved. You can have a mediocre strategy and plan, but if your culture's great, you've got a good chance of making it happen. Anyway, there you go. We can move on to other stuff, I suppose.
No, brilliant.
Does that prompt anything? Any thoughts? Any questions from you, Chris? Does it resonate?
There's a lot to unpack there, Craig, but I think you've done a brilliant job trying to help us navigate the whole thing around culture, selection, and battle management. And by having those lenses to look through, I feel like I'm doing an essay with my son about GCSE, and that's who's the best leader out of, and why were they successful or unsuccessful? So it'll be really interesting, in the go forward for Sir Keir to think about. I mean, clearly, there's a deliberate culture reset over the last 5 years, and then the selection, brutal selection in terms of being in and out of favour, in and out of step, say, right, like with where the direction is. And now it comes down to battle management. So that will be really interesting, particularly because under the spotlight in some of those, despite the Conservatives and despite Rishi, having everything that has happened in those specific leadership debates, he didn't do particularly well, surprisingly enough, even though he's off of a really strong cultural mandate. And as we've just seen with the results, it's an incredibly powerful position. So, it'll be fascinating to see his battle management and his team's battle management, I think. Because that's, the proof's in the pudding now, right? It's easy to kind of point from the side.
Yeah, it is. And based on the premise that a plan only survives first contact with the enemy, and then you've got to be on the balls of your feet and ready to adapt and so on. Who knows what he's going to face, for example, dealing with unions. He's got potentially a whopper with, Tata Steel wanting to pull out of Wales, and they've just, made some headway in Wales again. That it is interesting. I think that the result seems to reflect, yes, people migrating back to Labour who previously had gone to the Conservatives, but more a meltdown of the Conservative. Lib Dem have done record of gains over in the last 24 hours. So it's not just the one way, but it does reflect for me a loss of trust and faith that they'll be able to do what they say they're going to do. And I think that happens over time, and not being able to be held to account. So, and this is where Labour have got to be careful over the next, 5, potentially 10 years, is that once you're in power for so long, you start to become immune to what's going on outside of you. Everything gets focused internally. Because there's nothing external to worry about. Who are the enemy? When I was at Coca-Cola, you like this? When I was at Coca-Cola, they used to operate in regions. So I worked for the bottlers, CCE, Coca-Cola Enterprises. And the bottling distribution business was split into regions around the country, around the UK, or GB, around GB. And as a business, as a soft drinks business, Coca-Cola Enterprises outsold the nearest competitor, Britvic, by 4-1. Okay, number one cola brand, Coca-Cola. Number two cola brand, Diet Coke. Okay, then you get your Pepsis and stuff. Okay, so absolutely miles ahead. So, and I always remember being asked, so who your how your competition doing? How your competition? And being conscious of the fact that working in the Midlands, I said my competition was Yorkshire. Okay, Coca-Cola Yorkshire. So what that meant was that everything we were doing in the Midlands region, keep it close, keep it safe, because it means we can beat Yorkshire. Rather than we've got to work together as a national business to ensure that Britvic remain second. So competition became internal. And this is, to a degree, what you've seen with the Conservative Party. You've got Suella Braverman openly criticising somebody else looking for a leadership role potentially, and others. You've got, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's lost his seat, I gather, going to GB News, being an interview and criticising the Prime Minister and so on. This is what happens over time if you're not careful. And so Starmer needs to build his team. One of the other key things about the team, as a senior leadership team, the evidence, for those who are interested, there's a lot of work done by a lady called Ruth Wagerman, or Ruth Wagerman, depending which way you want to pronounce it, who's Harvard and a few other American universities, on highly successful senior leadership teams. Okay, not just teams, but senior leadership teams. Okay, and there are certain criteria which she and her team identified as being crucial. One of which, so there's some really obvious stuff about having a common purpose. Why the hell are we a team? We've got to have something in common. So you had that. But one of the key things was stability. Keeping the team together as long as you can. So as a senior leadership team, you're always going to face things like your high-performing members of that team getting promoted or being poached by another organisation or whatever. You can't do much about that. But what you can't have is people coming and going the whole time in the team, because you can't build this sense of mutual trust and mutual respect and being able to read each other and being able to really work in a high-performing environment. And if you look at the way that the government over the last few years has operated, how many Home Secretaries have we had? How many Health Secretaries have we had? How many? That's not keeping your team together. It must have driven the civil service nuts, having yet another minister coming in or Secretary of State coming in. Just got the brief through to this one, and they're off again. Why are they off? Well, because there's been another reshuffle, because so-and-so wasn't like to kick so-and-so out or whatever's happened. So we've reshuffled the whole pack. You can't get high performance if that's happening all the time. There has to be some stability. So my advice to Keir Starmer would be, once you've picked your team, keep it. Keep it for a while. Build it and keep it. And let it do some work together before you do it. And maybe think about a succession plan. Think about your succession plan now, and a pipeline of people coming through. It's so if you look at, there's a book called Good to Great, Chris, which by a chap called Jim Collins. I've done a number of pieces of work with people in the past who said, "Hey, Craig, theme this year, good to great, good to great. We're going to go from good to great." And I said, "Oh, hang on. Let's go from shit to not bad first, and then we can go from good to great. You can't just go from dreadful to great, because great is about fine margins. Okay, you can get 80% there quite quickly with some basic hygiene factors, and then that bit that gets you above is to be great over time is the really tough bit. And there's a couple of really good examples. So the book looks at companies like Gillette, a couple of American banks, some who suffered in the crash 2008, a company called Kimberly-Clark, who do toilet paper and other things, but an outstanding company in their field over time. But one of the things is the type of leadership that has. Okay, type of leadership. And basically he defines leadership as 1 to 5. There are different levels of leadership, and I won't go through them all. But the thing about 5 is legacy. Okay, legacy. There's very little to tell between a level 4 leader and a level 5 leader, because they're getting a lot of stuff done. They're incredibly successful. But what happens when they're gone? What happens next when they're gone? So what are they thinking about in terms of succession planning? How are they making sure that the organisation is bigger than them, and that when they go, it's great? It is the one flaw in Alex Ferguson's time at Manchester United. Level 4 leader knocked it out of the flipping park. But the legacy, and we talked about in the pre-chat about David Moyes, handing over to David Moyes, awful transition. So the legacy is fantastic time after, Alex Ferguson was there, but mediocre since. Whereas the great organisations, you could talk about, and I hate this as an Evertonian, Liverpool in the 70s and 80s, a string of 3-4 managers, Shankly, Fagan, Paisley, whatever, all winning trophies. And why? They were promoted from within, and the culture stayed the same. By the way, Klopp culture. Okay. Culture. And battle management was also pretty good too. But anyway, so this business of what happens next. So if you're Starmer, it's team, build it, make sure it's as effective as possible as it can be, keep it stable for as long as you can. However, be ready for the next step, so that in 5 years' time, you've delivered something, you've got a credible, trusted team that's looking after their respective areas, and people have faith in the future. Then he's going to win again. Otherwise, you end up doing what Conservatives have done: record majority in 2019, kicked out with the biggest loss they've ever had 5 years later. It's quite a lesson, I think, in an example of poor senior leadership, not necessarily politics. It's leadership.
I think that it's fascinating listening to you, Craig, talking about those two concepts. And the two bits that really stand out for me, going back to our old world, if you like, and I know we've talked about one of these before, Craig, was you touched on it right at the end, was the legacy piece.
Yeah.
I know we've shared a lot about that, the legacy book about the All Blacks, and one of their key principles being, leaving the shirt, each player leaving the shirt in a better position than they picked it up in. And that comes back to that leadership piece. Are you really leaving the party or the organisation or the team that you've left in the corporate space in that better position and in a legacy position where it's going to continue growing? And it doesn't feel to me like that's, in the corporate world, is particularly held at the top of the rankings of the people who do come in at those senior leader positions, because they are there to make an impression and then move on and make the next impression, not necessarily for the greater good, to your point in there.
Yeah.
And the other bit that probably goes in with that a little bit, I remember talking to a couple of fairly senior leaders in HSBC in the previous org, and when we talked about teamwork with them, and it was quite surprising, they both said, we're not a team, we're a group of people who look after different functions, and therefore we don't need that team support because we've just got these people that run different functions. And it felt to me like that was a flaw to an extent in there, of going, actually, you're missing something. Yes, you look after different functions, but if you're really not supporting each other and making each other better and driving for that greater good, then what are you doing?
Yeah.
Maybe it comes down to the performance management aspect in corporate world as to how we drive performance, but it feels like that's a real miss in a lot of organisations.
Well, it absolutely.
Sorry, Craig.
Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, I think this is almost coming back to what you said right at the beginning, right? In terms of training people to be leaders ahead of time, rather than kind of like falling flat on your face, or just being, quite frank, ignorant around like what is required. So, incompetence or just or just the lack of awareness. Either way, it's not a good thing.
No, it's not. And I think you're I suppose Keir Starmer, we talk about politics again, but at least got some experience because he led the Crown Prosecution Service. So he has, he's been a leader in the past, as opposed to, I mean, you see this in football all the time. People being made managers who've been great players and are pretty poor at doing it. And then in the last one shift, there'll be others who actually are quite naturally gifted, who make it work. But the team bit, and there's this sort of sacrifice for the common good. We don't help ourselves. And one of the things I typically try and do, and mentioning one or two names, Paul Venterside was one that took this on. Stop calling yourself an executive committee. Stop calling yourself an exco, because a committee means something very different to a team. So call it senior leadership team, call it a leadership team or a management team, because the definition of a team is there's a common good. And it might mean that you as a member of the team might have to make a sacrifice, however small or big, for the common good. So my particular, but you've got to be careful in how you reward that and so on, because typically in committees, and you talk about our silos, I'm not going to give up anything because it'll affect my bonus and my team's bonus, everything else. So why would I do this? When I was at Aon, part of the challenge was, as somebody who dealt with my military career, I used to help grow the business around terrorism insurance, political risk, political violence, kidnapping, ransom, product, tampering, and so on. So we used to have that. But of course, you then go to the client manager and say, can I come and talk to your client, who's a food producer, whatever, about this, or a hotel chain that's got hotels in Mexico and Pakistan and all sorts of areas where it's high risk. And they'll say, why? Well, I think they probably could do with some terrorism insurance or everything else. They said, well, why would I do that? Because if they spend their insurance pot on your stuff, I lose, because I'm rewarded on what I sell in on property and business interruption and all the other stuff. Your niche bit steals from me. So no, don't go anywhere near my client. Whereas actually you want to grow the whole thing. So it's, and Chris, that resonates with you, Chris. Go on.
Yeah, 100%, right? So building those common values, the rules of the ship, getting that right, coming back to your first point around that culture embedding of like what the rules of the road are, the rules of the ship.
Yeah.
That's like fundamental, in terms of, coming back to your point around culture being like just the cornerstone that everything kind of like comes from. Yeah. So you're talking about the on the battlefield, like and that's because the selection's been based around strict criteria of delivering XYZ performance, rather than overall this is what the purpose, the true vision of the wider organization is. That stuff, getting that right, is just like
so we do
foundational. It's like foundational, spending time on that, but the temptation is not to do it.
Yeah, you're absolutely, it's a cracking word. Foundations, putting the foundations in. I'd recommend. There's a program that keeps getting repeated on Sky Sports, and the messages are not about sport. The messages are just general ones. It's called Secrets of Success, and it talks about leaders in different sports. Yes, it looks at cricket, but it also looks at Toto Wolff in Formula One and Christian Horner. Culture. Look what's happening to Red Bull this year. So you've got a number of those, but they do talk about the need for, and Klopp, they talked to the Klopp, and Klopp mentions absolutely specifically, he talks about the difficulty of leaving players on the bench. Not even that, leaving players off the side. And I did some work with Northampton Saints. And at the time, they'd just sacked a previous coach. And they got two players who they promoted to be interim coaches. A chap called Paul Grayson and a chap called Budge Pountney. For those who follow rugby, you probably know who they are. And two things worth of note there. One, Paul Grayson, who I sat down with fairly soon afterwards, said, "Craig, I've been given the job of my dreams and I'm not ready. I've never, been a head coach before. I wanted to be an assistant, and I've been given this. But how can I say no?" And then one of the challenges that they had was that they had playing for them at the time a chap called Carlos Spencer, who was an All Black, who was their marquee signing. Okay, paid more than probably the rest of the team put together, and he was there. And I was asked, how do I tell him he's on the bench? How do I tell him that he doesn't fit the overall plan? And I said, well, you've got to be honest. You've got to say, this is how we want to play, and your skills don't fit that right now. But they will at some stage, but right now, that's what it is. And he has to deal with that for the whole team. To be fair to him, he was fantastic because he backed it all the way. He played, but he came back into the team later on, and it was a start as he, is anyway. But it's a bit like saying to a brain surgeon, okay, whose world is about being the best brain surgeon in the whole flipping hospital and elsewhere. By the way, you've got to sit on that chair today. You're not going to do any brain surgery because we've got another one, and I'm going to bring you on if he gets it wrong. So, well, I'm trained as a brain surgeon. I can't do any brain surgery. What's the point of this? So it's a real challenge in that environment. But importantly, what helps people to cope with all of that is the reason why. And Simon Sinek talks a lot about start with why we're doing things, and so on. The military have a thing called mission command, which is I'm going to give you, Chris, your tasks. So you're going to do this. But here's the unifying purpose. So you're going to do your bit in order that collectively we can achieve the above. So the important thing is to understand the strategic intent. So why are we doing this? One level up, two levels up, whatever. And there's all your stuff, okay? But in the knowledge of why we're doing this, you can make your own decisions as to what you need to do. Because if you end up, I've been given tasks A, B, and C. I've actually just spotted D, and I could do this, but I've not been asked to do this, but I know it supports the strategic intent. I know it's within budget. I know I've got time to do it. I know I've got the resources to do it, and I know it doesn't interfere with anybody else's work. Get on with it. And if it doesn't go quite right, then the boss would at least know, this is a cultural thing as well, that you've done it with the best of intentions, and it was supporting what he or she has asked you to do, or why you're doing it, so you get backed. No one's going to criticise you for it. But what it stops, of course, is micromanagement. This was a thing called Auftragstaktik, which was developed by the Germans, actually, and really developed during the Second World War, when communication lines were a long way back to Berlin, and they had to find a way of giving people at the front freedom to operate without passing everything back to Hitler. And the whole of NATO uses this now. And I was serving in the School of Infantry at the time in the mid-late 80s, early 90s, when this was being implemented in the British Army. So go away from what we call task missions or task-oriented leadership, which is do this, to mission, which is do this, in order that we can achieve something at the top. And once I know the why, I can start to be more flexible. And by the way, over to you. I'm not going to tell you how to do this. The best example of this, if anyone wants to Google it or look at it else, about intent, we've just had the 80th anniversary of D-Day. If you look for Montgomery's plan on a page, okay, D-Day plan of a page, the night before the invasion, he wrote his plan for the invasion on one piece of paper in pencil. Okay, the largest seaborne invasion in the history of the planet, and it's on one page. And but he gives intent. That's all he does. He gives intent. He says things like the first wave of troops and artillery and everything else to be on shore by the end of the first tide. That's it. Right, over to you. By the way, the first wave includes these troops. I want all of that on the beach by the end of the first tide. Okay? That's it. Next, I want this lot following up, and I want this happening. And I want, before we hit the beach, before 8 hour, I want this lot on fire support. So the guns, aircraft, everything else, the Navy, flatten the place until this moment, then everything else on. How it happens, over to you. And at the bottom, written in capital letters, underlined 3 times in pencil, the key to all of this is simplicity. Keep it simple. And then people get on. Keep it simple, trust people to get on with it. Admittedly, they've done lots of training. They practiced a lot of stuff and so on. So they weren't doing it blind, but they were given permission. You can't afford to have somebody trying to micromanage you when you're on that sort of thing. So it's there's some really important stuff around intent and simplicity and trust and so on. But it doesn't happen like that. This is why, Mr. Starmer or Sakir, take your team away, go and spend a few times getting, as you described it there, Chris, get the foundations in, agree the ground rules, how are we going to operate, let's build some trust in each other, let's make sure we understand how everybody likes to operate, maybe do a psychometric, and understand why people behave in the ways that they do and work around that, and then let's get stuff done. I wish them well, because it's in everyone's interest that they get it right.
No, I think that's fantastic, Craig. It's really, really interesting insight covering all diversities from politics, sport, business, all aspects there. I think it's covered everything we've touched on, I think, in the podcast over the last 11 episodes as well. So it's really, really good. And thank you very much indeed for joining us, Craig, and giving us that insight. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it.
Thanks, Craig. It's been brilliant. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
No, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for asking me.
Definitely. And hopefully I'll be back at some point if we have second guests on as well. But thank you very much, Evan. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it as much as Chris and I have on this one as well. Remember to subscribe and like on all of our platforms. You've been listening to Just About Managing Podcast. I've been Lee Smith. He's been Chris Dingle. And this week, he's been Craig Preston. Goodbye, everyone.